Good evening and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor to serve as director of Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Hunter College President Jennifer Rabb, I want to welcome you and tell you all how pleased we are to welcome Professor Nancy Foner back to the Roosevelt House stage, albeit virtually. The last time we had the opportunity to host Professor Foner, it was for a memorable 2015 discussion of her previous book, Strangers No More: Immigration and the Challenges of Integration in North America and Western Europe, a collaboration with her colleague in sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center, Richard Alba. That conversation occurred just as the 2016 presidential campaign was getting underway, which, as we know, we remember, inspired, maybe inspired is the wrong word, but triggered much debate on the issue of immigration. Well, here we are, 6 years later, excited to present a follow-up to that discussion because Nancy has come up with an important follow-up book. She will be in conversation with the director of the Migration Policy Institute at the NYU Law School, Muzafer Chisti, and this time the conversation will center on Nancy's book, One Quarter of the Nation: Immigration and the Transformation of America, and the many, and one might say countless ways in which immigrants and their families continue to redefine who we are as a nation. From the critical role immigrants have played in reshaping electoral politics and party alignments, to the immeasurable effect of immigration on the economy, to the cultural infusion provided by food and literature and art. Nancy's new book covers all of these subjects, and it's packed with fresh insight into how immigrants and their children, nearly 86 million people, have fundamentally transformed and enriched the American experience. While many books on the subject of immigration have focused on how America has changed immigrants, One Quarter of the Nation provides a needed and overdue exploration of how immigrants have changed America. Nancy Foner is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She's the author or editor of 20 books, including not only Strangers No More, but From Ellis Island to JFK, New York's Two Great Waves of Immigration, and One Out of Three, Immigrant New York in the 21st Century. She received the Distinguished Career Award from the International Migration Section of the American Sociological Association, a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, a Berlin Prize Fellowship, and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Muzafer Chisti, who is going to lead tonight's discussion, is an attorney and the director of the Migration Policy Institute, as I mentioned, at the NYU School of Law. His work focuses on U.S. immigration policy at the federal, state, and local levels, the intersection of labor and immigration law, immigration enforcement, and immigration integration, as well as civil liberties as an issue. I was going to say a side issue, but a relevant issue to immigration and immigrants, to be sure. Prior to joining MPI, he served, among other assignments, as chairman of the boards of both the National Immigration Forum and the National Immigration Law Center, and as a member of the American Bar Association's Coordinating Committee on Immigration. He's testified extensively on immigration before Congress and is frequently quoted on this subject in the media. So it's going to be an extraordinarily informed discussion from two great scholars and influencers of policy. Before we begin, my usual note on how this evening's program will run. At the conclusion of the discussion, we will turn to audience Q&A, and that will be facilitated by our programming curator, Mac Barrett, who will magically appear when the time is right to turn to your questions. But at any time during and throughout the program, please type your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Do it as early as you wish. The more likely the question will be responded in the limited time we will have. To purchase a copy of One Quarter of the Nation, which I'm pleased to say I've read, it's really important, and it's page-turning book on aspects of immigration you might not have thought about. Please use the link and discount code in the chat room at the bottom of the screen. So Nancy, Muzafer, it's a pleasure to welcome you both back to Roosevelt House, next time hopefully in person. And with that, please welcome Nancy Foner in conversation with Muzafer Chisti.
Thank you so much, Harold. And it's a delight to be back at the Roosevelt House, even though virtually last time we had a really delightful evening there, which was followed by nice drinks and hors d'oeuvres, which we unfortunately will miss today, but hope to see all of you who have joined us virtually today in person sometime soon. It's a real honor to be back at Roosevelt Institute, and particularly a delight to do it again with Nancy, whose book with Richard Alba called No Strangers, No More, I was really fortunate to moderate a discussion about in 2016. Now, this is a book which is much closer to my heart. It goes closer to my expertise, and I have to say this is the book, I have read all pages of it, and some even footnotes, to see that I could etch them in my memory as to where the facts came from. This is an extraordinarily important book, I think, because it talks about a slice of America that is hugely important in how it has shaped the country and is frequently not understood, because it has happened gradually and it has happened away from many radar screens. Even many immigrants who are subjects of this book don't appreciate the importance of their own contribution to the country. So in that regard, it is a real gift. It's also a particular gift to those of us who have to speak on these issues and wish we knew all that Nancy has pulled together in this very, very interesting and accessible way in this volume. Nancy is an old friend. She is one of the most influential scholars of immigration in the field. And I've learned a huge amount from her, and various scholars and policymakers continue to learn so much from her. So Nancy, congratulations on this extremely important book, and welcome back to the Roosevelt House. So, so let me start with the beginning, which is the title of the book. It's called One Quarter of the Nation. And I have to commend you, first of all, that you explain the title in the very page one of your book, which not many authors do. But those may not have gone to page one. Could you explain to us why you chose this title and the genesis?
Okay, well, first of all, I have to thank everybody, right? I want to thank Harold for the lovely introduction. I want to thank Mac Barrett for organizing this, and of course, Muzafer Chisti for coming and being willing to have this conversation. So one quarter of the nation, well, it refers to the number of immigrants and their children in the US. But let me just backtrack just a little bit, because the numbers of immigrants and their children in the US now is really extraordinary. I say these numbers all the time, and then every time I say them, I think they're extraordinary. By 2020 in the US, there are 45 million immigrants who are living in the United States. That's unprecedented. It's the largest number since second census records have been kept. And together with their children, they total nearly 86 million, and that's accounting for 26% of the population, and that's more than one quarter of the country. To put that a little bit in perspective, first of all, that's the absolute number. And so there's also the percentage of immigrants, and immigrants themselves, just foreign born, are about 14% of the US population. It's still not as high as it was in 1910 or 1890, but we're getting there. But also to think about the numbers in terms of change over the last 50 years. because in 1970, and that was just a few years after the 1965 immigration law, that really revolutionized the immigration system in the US and made it possible for so many immigrants to come once again. In 1970, there were a little under 10 million immigrants in the country, and now it's 45 million. So that's been a huge increase. And it's not just the numbers that have changed. If we go back and we look in 1960, for example, 75% of the immigrants in the US in 1960 were European. Today, that figure is 11%. Most immigrants come now from Latin America, from Asia, and one of the newer streams, and many of you may notice this because we live in New York, are African immigrants, who are now 5% of immigrants in the US. So there's been this enormous change and enormous numbers, and this is having a huge impact on this country, which I think often people, we become so used to it, or we take it for granted, and we don't really, as Moose was saying, we take it for granted. Even immigrants take it for granted, and we don't know enough about how immigrants have been changing the country.
The subtitle of this book is The Transformation of America, Immigration and the Transformation of America. As Harold rightly pointed out, most scholars have focused their attention on how immigrants have transformed themselves when they come. But you focus on the flip side of the question, which is how immigrants who have, especially the post-1965 immigrants, which again, to remind the audience, was a big change in our immigration law in 1965, which ended the national origin quota system that had been put in place from 1920 to 1965, which has essentially barred immigration of everyone other than European countries. That wave of migrants post 65 and their children have transformed America. And you do them very neatly in your 5 chapters, transforming the race, racial order, transforming our cities and our suburbs and our towns, transforming the economy, transforming the culture, and transforming electoral politics. And that's why you do them this very interesting sort of cross-discipline way, but in a journalistic, readable style. So tell us about the 5 buckets of transformation that you note in your book.
Okay, so this gives me a chance actually to lay out the main themes of the book very briefly, and to give you a sense of how immigrants are changing America. Let me start with race, because few things have changed this country's racial picture more conspicuously than the last 50 years of immigration. For much of the 20th century, race was mainly a matter of Black and white. And if we go back to 1960, fully 85% of Americans were white. Hispanics were a mere 3.5% of the population, and Asians were barely visible at less than 1%. Today, whites, and that's non-Hispanic whites alone, have shrunk to around 60% of the population. Hispanics at 19% are the largest minority group now in the country, and Asians are around 6%. While the percentage of Americans who are Black is not very different from it was in 1960. What is different is that almost a tenth, or about a tenth, of our immigrants, mostly from Africa and the Caribbean. And this in turn has led to astonishing changes in the composition of cities all over the country. Even in cities that already had a substantial Hispanic populations, the numbers exploded in the last half century. And that's owing to immigration, but also to births. Just to give you some, the city of Los Angeles, for example, it went from less than 10% Hispanic in 1960 to nearly half in 2019. Miami-Dade County is in a category all of its own. Now it's a Latino global metropolitan giant. 69% Hispanic in 2019, up from about 5% in 1960. And if we look at central cities in the US, together, all of them, nearly a quarter of the residents were Hispanic in 2019, That's a change from 3% in 1970, and the proportion of Hispanics in the suburb has mushroomed as well. In the South, the old black-white binary is being altered by the growing Hispanic as well as Asian inflows. Asian Americans have not only grown by leaps and bounds in cities like New York and Los Angeles, which have long had Chinatowns, though they're historic Chinatowns, though they've been very small. But Asian Americans have multiplied in areas where they're hardly present as half a century ago. Places like Houston, Las Vegas, and Minneapolis, just to name a few. And just to come back to New York City, in 1970, 1% of New York City residents were Asian Americans. It's 14% now. So even, New York actually has experienced a great demographic change as a result of immigration, as of many, many cities in the US. Immigration has also altered how Americans think about race. East Asians, once considered the yellow peril in a common popular view, have now become, in another common popular view, the model minority. Even though as spiking hate crimes during the pandemic powerfully remind us racial discrimination and prejudice against Asian Americans is still with us. Immigration has changed the very words we used to talk about race. The very category Hispanic is a modern day invention, rarely used 50 years ago, and now it's an established category of identity among non-Hispanics, as well as many with origins in Latin America, along with the term Latino and most recently Latinx. While systemic racism against Black people, as we know, is all too persistent, immigrants, in the phrase of a sociologist, Todd Hamilton, are remaking Black America. Now, as I said, about 10% of Black America, but with their children, around a fifth. There's a greater awareness among many Americans, both Black and non-Black, of ethnic or national origin differences within the Black population. And this is especially true in cities that have large numbers of Black immigrants. And that the cities with the largest population of Black immigrants are New York and the Miami metro areas. But also there are places like Minneapolis and Lewiston, Maine, where Africans are very highly visible drivers of increases in the overall Black population. And immigration has also affected how the white majority sees itself. That's something I'm going to come back to. But although whites of European origin are still associated with privilege, and they often take their white identity for granted, many whites have become increasingly aware of themselves as one racial group in an increasingly diverse America. Around a fifth of white Americans, according to some evidence, have not just become more conscious of themselves as whites and their whiteness, but also feel that whites' dominant position is under threat, in part owing to the decline in the proportion of whites, as well as economic, political, and occupational gains of non-white groups. And this leads us to electoral politics, another area that I discuss in the book. For one thing, immigrant origin voters have helped transform the Democratic and Republican electoral coalitions. Let me say, I'm saying helped, because they're really not, they have been a factor. They have not obviously been the only factor, but they have played a big role. As late as 1980, more whites in the US identified as Democrats than as Republicans. By 2010, white Republicans substantially outnumbered white Democrats. And at the same time, the Democratic Party has increasingly become a party supported by non-whites. By 2019, according to a Pew National survey, racial minorities made up 40% of registered voters who identified or leaned toward the Democratic Party. And immigration has been pivotal in these changes. On one side, it's been critical in the large growth in the share of minority registered voters in the national electorate, from 15 to 30% between 1996 and 2019. And racial minority voters have trended Democratic. Black voters are overwhelmingly Democratic, but Asian American and Hispanic voters also trend heavily Democratic. In the last 4 presidential elections, 2/3 or more voted for the Democratic candidate. On the other side, many whites, especially non-college educated whites, have been drawn to the Republican Party, and its anti-immigrant and anti-minority appeals, motivated in part by anxiety, fears, and resentment that millions of overwhelmingly non-white newcomers will undermine the basic identity of the nation and marginalize and disadvantage whites. And in the context of racial resentments, immigration has emerged as a major focus of political debates and campaigns, another change in the realm of politics. Overt anti-immigrant rhetoric, not just dog whistles, but overt anti-immigrant rhetoric became a staple in the strategies of many Republican leaders, most notably, of course, Donald Trump, who gave it a legitimacy in political discourse at the highest levels as he sought to mobilize his core constituency. And of course, Donald Trump may not be president anymore, but Republican leaders are still doing this. Okay, they're still using that rhetoric, and newscasters, right? Tucker Carlson, primary among them, or one of them. On the whole, however, immigration has brought enormous benefits as it's created far-reaching changes, and that's something that's very evident when we look at cities and towns around the country. Immigrants, by their sheer numbers, have provided a lifeline in many cities that were losing population, and New York City is, by the way, a prime example of this. Immigration has played a key role in the growth of places like Las Vegas and Orlando that were becoming major metropolitan areas for the first time. And they've revitalized many rural communities, slowing population loss, and even in some cases, enabling the populations to grow. In many central cities, immigration helped deteriorating neighborhoods make a comeback by lifting population and spurring economic growth. Again, that's, for New Yorkers, that's been true. Brighton Beach is one of the classic examples of this. And immigration was a factor behind the decline in violent crime in urban America from the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. When it comes to the economy, immigration has fostered innovation, fueled growth, and helped to shape the development of whole industries. And immigrants have had an outsized role in high tech, which is now one of the national economy's largest components, starting and running major new companies and spearheading innovations in them. In 2018, just to give one statistic, half of the 91 US companies valued at $1 billion or more, $1 billion or more, had at least one immigrant founder, and more than 80% of these companies employed immigrants in key management or product development roles. And it's not just in high tech. Immigrants have are involved in other businesses as well. Nationwide, 1 in 5 business owners in 2014 were immigrants, and they founded about a quarter of new firms. Immigrants have helped any number of service industries grow and flourish. They've reduced shortages in medical and healthcare professions. This, I guess, is an astounding figure that many may not be aware of. 28% of the physicians and surgeons in the United States are immigrants, and 16% of the registered nurses. And immigrants have filled jobs and driven up demand in a number of low-wage occupations, including childcare and elder care, because the millions of immigrants consume goods and use services. They've boosted the economy and job growth, including in an array of public service jobs. In New York City, for example, immigrants, the schools are very overcrowded, in large part due to immigration. But without immigrants, schools would have closed, and there would be fewer jobs for teachers, fewer jobs for school custodians, for food workers, for bus drivers. And this is just one example. A big question is whether immigrants have hurt Native workers. And the overwhelming consensus in the economic literature, and economists have written a lot about this, is that immigration's adverse effects on US-born workers' wages and employment have overall been minimal. And I say overall been minimal. I mean, this is looking at the big picture nationally, not at particular workplaces. Among other things, because immigrants increase demand for goods and services, and also because immigrant small firms and startups often generate opportunities for native-born workers. And lastly, immigrants are invigorating and indeed remaking American culture. The foods we eat, the music we listen to, the films we watch, and the books we read. If earlier Jewish and Italian immigrants gave us bagels and pizza, today salsa, outsourced ketchup, and tacos are standard fare. In 2015, Chinese restaurants in the US. There were about 40,000 Chinese restaurants in the US in 2014. They outnumbered all the Burger Kings, Kentucky Fried Chickens, and McDonald's combined. Immigrants and the second generation are new authors on bestseller lists. You have to, those in New York Times Book Review, practically every week has a new novel by or a memoir by an immigrant or second generation author. Among the best known, Jhumpa Lahiri for The Namesake. She won a Pulitzer Prize for that. Junot Diaz, who won a Pulitzer Prize for The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Immigrants in the second generation have taken popular music in new directions. Just to give one more example, pop music superstars have roots in Latin America. With roots in Latin America, have brought Latin rhythms fused with American popular music to mainstream audiences. One of the best known is Gloria Estefan, Miami-based and Cuban-born. Caribbean immigrants have introduced the sounds of Jamaican reggae, Cuban salsa, Dominican merengue, and they also have played a key role in the creation and development of hip hop. Many people think it was just simply an African-American creation, and although African-Americans were involved, so were Afro-Caribbeans and Latinos. So let me end there saying, I hope you read the book, of course, because this was just very brief, going through what Bruce calls the different buckets in the book, right? The different chapters in the book, where I go into much more detail and depth and complexity. And I hope we get to talk about, and I assume we'll talk about more of these issues in our conversation. So,
Nancy, that's an excellent executive summary of the book, if I could say that quickly. And again, I commend it to all of you who want to get a quick glimpse of this slice of American life. So let me just, we don't have that much time, but let me start with a few. One is that since you mentioned Trump, and it's hard to have Trump as always the elephant on the Zoom, that a lot of people, I have myself contributed to this thesis that it took the country 50 years to come to terms with the changes of the 1965 laws, which produces this wave of immigrants in the form of the election of Trump. And that sort of gets both to the racial transformation and the economic transformation of the country. In one of these very interesting kinds of phrases used called racialized economics in your chapter. Tell us quickly the role of racialized economics in the election of Trump.
Well, I mean, I talked about the role of race, right, already, but obviously there are economic factors, the globalization, the decline of manufacturing, the insecurity of many, particularly non-college educated whites, who are a very large constituency for Donald Trump. But it's not, but it takes the form, their resentment, their anxieties and fears take the form of resentment of not just of immigrants and racial minorities in the country, because they feel that they're being left behind, that the phrase that Arlie Hochschild uses in her book, right? That somehow immigrants and racial minorities are getting advantages and that they're not getting, and that and they're resentful of it. And Donald Trump certainly builds on that, right?
Yeah, so in this, I think one of the figures you cite very effectively in the book, talking about the election of Trump, but just on the Republican Party, as to how sort of politicized this immigration cohort has become, that today only 38% of Republicans, as against 83% of Democrats, think immigration is good for the country. That is radically different, even 20 years ago, from where the country was equally split among Republicans and Democrats on how they felt about immigration. Now that in some ways explains almost everything, certainly in the world of politics. So do you want to agree, disagree,
I agree, yes. Well, I mean, I don't know, I mean, yes, I mean, it's interesting because in the immigration world, people often cite the figures about, they'll say, well, a large percentage, the majority of Americans are very favorable towards immigration. But once you break it down by party lines, doesn't look like that, as you're saying. I mean, as the figures are quite it's very polarized issue.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that it's both that they have these, there are these resentments, there are these anti-immigrant feelings, but the politicians, Trump, and also Fox News, you know, plays on this all the time, and it exacerbates it. I mean, you know, Tucker Carlson talks about replacement theory. You know, that the Democrats want to replace the white population. Studies show that when people hear that the white population is declining, that increases their anti-immigrant feelings. You know, and so I think there are these fears, and part of it is towards immigrants and people, but also it's obviously clearly about racial minorities, African Americans as well.
Yeah. So let me just shift to a broader theme, which is you described rightly that this wave of immigration is a momentous one. But we also know there was another wave of immigration in the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, I like to think that we began the 21st century exactly the way as we began the 20th century, with two big waves of momentous immigration. Everything else in the middle, if you do a graph chart, was the trough in immigration. And that was mostly Southern and Eastern European, Jews and Italians and Slavs, which were equally resented as some waves of immigrants are resented today. But tell us the difference between that momentous wave of immigrants and today's momentous wave of immigrants.
Well, there are many differences, right? Of course, I was interested in the book, of course, in their impact on the United States, rather than their own experiences as much. But clearly, yes, there are multiple. There are differences in one thing in the educational level, the educational levels of the immigrants who are coming then and now. Today's immigrants include a very high percentage of professional and highly educated people. Again, something I think many people are not aware of. About a third of immigrants in the United States today have a BA degree or more. Yes, 26% have less than a high school education, but we're getting a very high, and increasingly actually with the immigrant flows over time, they're becoming more highly educated. So one big difference between then and now in terms of the immigrants who are coming is the levels of education. They're coming from different places, obviously, from different cultures, and they're coming to a very different America. I think that makes a big difference as well. Immigrants today are coming to a post-civil rights America. It hasn't changed everything, but has made a difference. I mean, if you, in terms of immigrants, there were actually West Indian immigrants who came early in the 20th century, and they did not go to the South. They came to New York. And of course, they wouldn't go to the South, one, because there were no job opportunities for them in the South, because they already had their own source of low-wage labor, but also because it was a segregated South. And today we find immigrants dispersing all over the country. They're not just, and that's another change, by the way, in terms of, there's so many differences in terms of dispersion. They were concentrated very heavily at the turn of the 20th century in the Northeast and in Midwest and industrializing centers. And today they're virtually all over the country. And so that's another difference. They're less concentrated. I don't know, we could go on and on and on about the differences between them. One difference that's often said, and that's somewhat distorting, maybe I should say it is distorting, is many people say, well, today's immigrants are not white. And that's the big difference, right? Because in the past, they were white. They were white, and that made a big difference. And yes, the Jews and Italians were legally white. They were not subject to the same discrimination that African Americans were. There were no anti-miscegenation laws applied to them. They could become naturalized citizens, unlike Asian Americans at the time. And yet they were seen as inferior whites, as inferior racially. They were, the Italians and Irish were reviled for their Catholicism. They were seen in many ways as not fully white. And yet they became, over time, eventually, their children and grandchildren became seen as part of an overall white community. And so one of the questions that's asked about the current immigration is, well, will that happen again? You know, will that, I mean, that's a big question. I really don't discuss that too much in the book, but it is a big issue, is will the experience of the Italian and Jewish immigrants and really their descendants be replicated among the descendants of the current immigrants who are not seen as white? I can't, you're muted.
Carry on the comparison, since the Strangers No More, the last time we hosted you and Richard at Roosevelt, it was about comparison between Europe and the US. So since, you know, Europe has gone through also significant big immigration change, and how would you distinguish between the transformation of Europe happening by their new wave of immigrants compared to transformation in America by the post-65 immigrants?
Well, in many ways, it's very similar, although the immigrants are different and Europe is different. In the book, in the conclusion, I talk about some of the ways that the racial history and the religious history of the United States has made a difference in terms of the kinds of changes that have occurred in Western Europe versus the United States. And in some ways, some of the changes are actually much more, perhaps more dramatically and due to immigration than in the US. So one change has to do with citizenship. In Western Europe, on mainland Western Europe or continental Western Europe, many of the countries had what jus sanguinis citizenship, you know, citizen, you inherited it from your parents. But it was actually a big factor in changes towards jus soli, which is birthright citizenship, has been the desire to integrate immigrants. It's been a response to the massive immigration that they've experienced in Europe from the global South. So that's one. In the United States, birthright citizenship was guaranteed to virtually everyone. It was after the Civil War. It was not designed for immigrants. It was designed for the freed Africans, you know, enslaved Africans, with them in mind. Another difference has to do with religion. In the United States, in England, in Britain, well, not in Britain, in France and Germany and many European countries, there are Muslim councils that were created by the government as intermediaries between the Muslim community and the government. And that kind of thing would not happen in the United States with government councils because of the relation between the state and religion in the United States. There's a much stronger tie between the state and religion in Europe. So those are, and also race relations legislation. Race relations legislation in the United States was a response to the civil rights struggles in the 1950s. It wasn't a result of immigration struggles. And so, but in Europe, race relations legislation, both in individual countries such as Britain or at the EU level, has been a response to the inflow, again, of immigrants from the global South. So immigrant, in some ways, you could say there have been greater institutional changes that are more fundamental in Europe in response to immigration than in the United States. Not that immigration has not had a huge impact in the United States, but these are very basic institutional rules about citizenship, for example, race relations legislation. So that's the comparison, and it also brings out how the role of racial and religious history shapes the kinds of changes that occur as a result of immigration. It shapes it, and that brings it out.
So talking about the underbelly, as every debate has an underbelly. This is one quarter of the nation. I have to quickly pivot to the 1/4 of our foreign born population today is unauthorized, which is also unprecedented. We have never had this level of unauthorized immigration, which is, you know, we have to admit is part of the story. I mean, we could say that immigrants have allowed middle-class Americans today to have upper middle-class aspirations. whether that's for them to have elder care or child care at call, or to have nail salons at every block in our cities, or to have us paying so little for our farm products and meat products. But a lot of these low wage occupations are home to the unauthorized. So just tell us a little bit about how you thought about the role of unauthorized in this momentous, new wave of immigration.
Well, I mean, it is a new aspect to immigration in the U.S. I mean, 100 years ago, it's interesting because people will often say, "Oh, my relatives were legal," unlike illegal immigrants today. But immigrants who came in the early 20th century, there were no numerical limits on immigration. There were no visas that you had to acquire before you could come to the United States. So there were very few undocumented immigrants. And in fact, undocumented immigration has grown, over the last few decades. In 1990, there were 3.5 million. Today, there are 10 to 11 million undocumented. And as Moose says, they're a quarter of the immigrant population. And they are a long settled population. Increasingly, about 2/3 of undocumented immigrants have been in the United States for 10 years or more. And they have no rights. Okay, they have virtually no access to social benefits. They risk deportation. They are confined to low wage jobs with no benefits, and often dangerous and risky jobs. And yes, you're right. They keep the middle, yes, they provide services to the middle class, many of them, or keep some of the industries going, like meat packing. A high percentage of undocumented immigrants in meat packing, and obviously agriculture as well. So, that's a big question for the nation. What do we do about these 11 million undocumented immigrants who are here? Well, Donald Trump had one, an answer, right? Build a wall, right? Which is actually, on the face of it, kind of ridiculous, because almost half of the undocumented are overstayers who come legally on temporary visas and overstay them. And because, in fact, Mexican migration has sort of been tapering off. Undocumented Mexican migration has been tapering off as Mexico's economy is better and fertility goes down. But yes, I mean, that's really one of the big issues, yes, a problem and that the country has to cope with. But we're not coping with it, are we, really? Because there's been no congressional legislation about this. The legalization program last was what, 1986? And what do you do in a country with 11 million people who have no legal rights to be here, but they're working and they're living here, and their children are growing up here? There, in many cases, there was a book actually on New York that talked about how undocumented immigrants, even reluctant to go to get benefits for their children, who are entitled to the benefits because they're concerned about it. They're worried about deportation. So, this is a real problem and dilemma for the nation. And if we're talking about change, it is a change that we have to deal with this, which we haven't, the question is we haven't really been dealing with it, that we have people who are suffering from the lack of legalization.
Yeah, which to my mind has also contributed to the political debate of this. As you mentioned, a lot of immigrants are now going to new destination states. They're not going to places which are familiar with immigrants. And for a number of these new destination states, their experience with immigration is a recent one. And it's unfortunately come through the lens of unauthorized immigration, which is then coloring all the politics.
It does color the politics, but I've thought about it, and I don't have really an answer to this, right? Because to what if all of a sudden all these immigrants were legalized, right, and had legal status, and we didn't have this huge number of undocumented immigrants, would that change the political attitudes of Americans towards immigrants? I'm not so sure, because I think a lot of the resentment, fears, anger about immigration are not just about legal status. I really don't think. I think they're about racial issues. And I don't, that's not, so I'm not, it's an open question, really, because we don't know what would happen. But I think, yes, I think there is this notion of the undocumented, and certainly Trump played on that a lot, right? That undocumented immigrants were violent, they were causing crime, they were ruining our cities, that we had to get rid of them. I mean, that was a big issue in his campaigns, right?
Yeah. So before we get to the Q&A, and we'll do that in a second, I mean, you are basically gung-ho on this cohort of population. You think this has been a huge success, which I think most people agree is true. The naysayers would tell you, so does that mean we should keep on increasing immigration? How about more? And if we have, 1/4 of them are unauthorized, then is there any place for enforcement in our immigration system? How do you respond to those numbers, limits and enforcement?
Well, I think there are a lot of pressures that are going to lead to continued immigration. That's how I would think about it. First of all, the baby boomers by 2030 will all be over the age of 65. So we have, and that's a very, very large cohort in the US. So we're going to have lots of people retiring from jobs, right? And we have low fertility. We have well below replacement fertility now. So not enough people are being born, and many are going to be retiring. And plus, we're going to have this aging population that's going to be needing Social Security, and we'll have fewer people paying in. So I think there are going to be pressures for continued immigration. Now, how it's going to resolve itself, I don't know. Will it be lawful permanent? I think a good chunk of it will be lawful permanent residents who will be allowed to come. Even, I think there will be pressure from employers for workers. Now, will that increase? Maybe we'll have a greater increase in temporary workers. And as we know, temporary workers often become undocumented workers when their contracts run out. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think we will have continued immigration. I think that will be part of America. And at the same time, the immigrants have children, their children have children, they're becoming Americans in their own way, but they're becoming Americans. I haven't talked about that, but there's a lot of literature on the integration of immigrants into American society, which largely focuses on the children of immigrants and the grandchildren of immigrants. And so we're having the integration of descendants of immigrants, and at the same time, I think we'll have continued immigration.
Great. And as long as we don't have answers to all questions, let's return to Q&A. So Mac, you want to tell us who is in the chat box asking these questions?
Yes, this has been excellent. The audience has asked many good questions. I'll read a few of them to you now. The first question from Gerald Oppenheimer. How would you compare the degree of wealth or poverty of current immigrants versus those who came to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century?
Good question. I don't have the data on that, but I would say that given what we know about the percentage of professional immigrants coming and highly educated immigrants coming, and it is true that not all of them can manage to get occupations commensurate with their previous status. But we do know that some do, and they move up as they come here. I would say that on the whole, that their wealth and poverty is greater. I mean, that they're doing better economically than those immigrants, right, who came in the past, who had fewer advantages when they arrived. Yeah, but I haven't seen any data on that, to be honest with you. But that's, yeah, I don't know. Moose, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think read the economy part of Nancy's book. It really summarizes the fundamental difference, I think, to me, about that the composition of today's post-65 immigrants to the turn of the century, 20th century. Let's just turn of the century immigrants are fundamentally poor peasants from Europe. The only educated people from Europe who came to the United States at that time were frankly Jews who were fleeing persecution. Everyone else was just people coming to escape from poverty. Today's immigrants are, the education profile is much higher. And Nancy quotes that, I think, it's like more than 35% people have bachelor's degree. She quotes about a number of people who have given the entrepreneurs, especially the startups, how many of them are immigrants or children of immigrants? How many have degrees in science and engineering? How many of them have given birth to the Fortune 500 companies? And as I told Nancy last week, one of the small data points she didn't mention in her book is how much immigrants have dominated the Nobel Prize winners of the last 2 decades in science and medicine fields, especially, and economics. So these are hard numbers about the fundamental difference between that cohort of immigrants and this cohort of immigrants.
Yeah.
In addition,
Yeah, and I think we should also keep in mind, maybe this is the place to mention it, that some groups and some very large groups have very high percentages of highly educated immigrants, Indian immigrants. Above something like 78% of Indian immigrants over the age of 25 have a BA degree or higher. Among Chinese, and which is also a very large group, it's over 50%. Koreans, it's over 50%. And a group that might surprise people, that's one of the most educated groups, are Nigerians, among whom there is a relatively small group, but still, not 62% have a BA or higher. So I think the recent immigrant groups that are coming in recent years, the figures show are higher percentage from Asia is we're getting many more Asian immigrants, and they're more highly educated than even earlier cohorts in the post-65 immigration. So I think that we would expect that their levels of, I don't know if I would put it wealth, but economic success and lower, and probably lower poverty. And by the way, the other lower poverty figure for at least the lawful permanent residents who've been here for 5 years or more is that the United States has a much more generous welfare state than it did 100 years ago, which would help even those low-wage immigrants who are lawful permanent residents and who have access to social welfare benefits, and that they were not available 100 years ago.
Okay.
Mac, next year.
Yeah, next question from my colleague at Roosevelt House, Deborah Gardner. Deborah says, chain migration was a very important factor in pre-1960, 1965 movement to the United States. How much has this pattern persisted in recent decades?
It's persisted. It's very strong. And by chain, people sending for their relatives, it's just common. And by the way, it is reinforced by immigration law, because current immigration since 1965, the change in immigration law, most immigrants who migrate here as local permanent residents come as family members. And US citizens, immigrants who are US citizens, can sponsor certain, minor children and spouses and parents apart from any numerical limitations. And so the nature of immigration law actually further encourages or enables family reunification. So it's a major way in which immigrants come to the United States, yes, through family ties.
Yeah, I mean, two-thirds of immigrants today come through family.
Yes, yeah, and that's been for a while.
There's a very specific question from Steve. Was Italy one of the countries on the 1924 quota list?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Major reason to impose it.
Yes, that was exactly. Yeah, the quota was so low compared to the millions who had come, Italians who had come before. Yeah, it was one of the major reasons. Jews and Italians were the big groups that were hit purposely.
Somebody who goes by MBL says this has been a fascinating conversation, and he or she asks, what about the proportion of immigrants in frontline jobs and in positions that many Americans don't want to take? For example, childcare, elder care, where wages are often too low. I'm curious about the numbers / proportions. And George Shea, also on this point, asks, what percentage of nurses are immigrants?
16%. I gave that figure. That's registered nurses, not nurses.
What was that number?
16% of registered nurses in the US are foreign born. Yeah. and very high percentage of nursing aides and, care workers, yes, are immigrants. I don't have the exact percentages at my fingertips on every single one of these occupations, but they're very highly, they're overrepresented compared to their proportion of the population in these jobs. And they, I think that, one question to ask, which we haven't discussed, is why are immigrants willing to do these jobs, right? That Americans shun, because they do take many jobs that Americans shun. And, one reason is because they have no choice. Many of them don't speak English. If they may have had higher level occupations in their home country, but they can't pass licensing exams. Their skills are not transferable to here. They may come with low levels of education, which is another problem. And immigrants who are undocumented first of all, they have a problem getting any job because their papers, unless, may not be recognized, they may not have the papers to get the job, right? And they'll be looked at more carefully in other settings. In addition to that, the undocumented have virtually no access to social benefits if they're not working. And lawful permanent residents can't get those benefits until 5 years. Plus, many immigrants, they see their stay as temporary. And so they think they're going to go back. And finally, and perhaps some might say most importantly, they can earn more money here, even in low status jobs, than they could earn in their country. So that they're all comparing wages here with what they could earn. I don't know if we have time, but I often talk about the woman that I lived with in Jamaica when I did my field work there in the 1960s, who was a teacher in Jamaica, but came here and had a terrible job initially as a live-in caregiver for the elderly. But she did it to have money for her daughter, to send her to university. And, that's the ability to earn more money here, to help your children. That's a very big motivation. And often to send money back to your family are very strong motivations that make all of these factors combine to make immigrants willing. Maybe the word willing is not the right word, but they will take jobs and work hard at them that native-born Americans shun and won't do.
Mac, Nancy does look at the COVID as a lens on the importance of immigrant workers and shows how important they were both to the frontline workers and to the essential workers, people who are healthcare workers, people who delivered foods and everything else while the rest of us could be on Zoom. We will at MPI issue a report soon on the COVID and immigration, which will provide numbers on all these things that we just
Yes, talked. In fact, I was going to say, for those of you who are interested in the details and numbers on these and other aspects of immigration, I cannot recommend the reports written by the Migration Policy Institute. That's where you should go. And in fact, Moose, I should say, right, has a really terrific report that just came out today that people might really want to read on the backlog, the enormous backlog for immigrant visas, and why people who are not able to get here because the visa process it's really been stalled. And he also wrote a very, very good report on what's happening under the Biden administration in terms of policy. MPI is just a wonderful source. I used it for my book over and over again, and Moose is one of the authors of many of the papers.
If it's all right with you, just do a couple more. Is that okay? Yeah. 2 more. So, Deborah, with another good question, this one about DACA. Why haven't supporters of DACA recipients made a better argument about the fact that the U.S. has already made a huge investment in them, chiefly through education, and therefore the U.S. would get a great return on that investment if they were legalized?
Well,
maybe I'll give that to Moose, but
arguments don't work in immigration any longer. This is not a contest about merits of arguments. It's all become politics. And, that's why I was keen to point out the number that Nancy laid about only 38% Republicans versus 83% Democrats think immigration is good. For the Republican Party, they have unfortunately concluded that all immigrants are unofficial members of the Democratic Party. So why would they like to make them citizens? It's not, it's just this raw political calculation, unfortunately. And that's what has sort of crippled the immigration debate for the last, 15 years or so.
Okay, and finally, a question from 2022 Rhodes Scholar, Hunter College student superstar,
Oh,
Devashesh Basnet. Thank you for the question, Dave.
I just have to say, before you go on, I just have to say that Dave was in my sociology of immigration class at Hunter
He's an
College.
MPI intern.
Ah, see, we both
He is all
we
over
can
this.
both claim, right, a connection to Dave. Hunter's wonderful Rhodes Scholar to be. Yeah.
So he asks, can you speak more in the context of your book how expanding contemporary pathways to citizenship and opening additional legal pathways through policy and law could help the trajectory of our nation's transformation?
Oh, well, yes. Well, yes. I mean, one could say, yes, it could certainly help give these, certainly immigrants a greater interest in participating in politics, right? And in the life of the country, if they're citizens, we know that, right? We know that citizenship also gives immigrants a greater sense of identity with the nation. So clearly that's important. It also gives them more rights in terms of not just benefits, but all kinds of rights as being an American and feeling fully American, which we do want immigrants to feel, right? We want them to feel part of the country and that, to be more welcoming, so I think clearly that's important. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just add quickly to this? Listen, I think the points that Nancy made about the demographic reality of the country is just, that's only in one direction. Baby boomers are retiring fast, whatever it is, 70,000 a day, I think. It's so the need for new immigrants as sort of young, wage earning, hardworking immigrants is only going to increase. I just tell you one very quick new point of data on it. We just passed the infrastructure bill, the biggest in history since the 1950s. If we don't get immigrant workers into the country in large numbers, who's going to do the infrastructure bill? We have a shell without people to fill it in. And that's going to be a big challenge as we confront once we start putting that stuff in. And, just to make the point about the unauthorized population, the reason we have unauthorized population of the level that we have today is not because people choose to be unauthorized, that they choose to come through these illegal ways, because we have very few legal channels for low-skilled workers to come to the United States. We take 1 million people a year as green cards. Only about 10,000 of them are reserved for low-skilled people. That explained to you as to why. So in many ways, the laws of supply and demand are working magically, as Nancy's book points out very carefully. But many low-skilled workers are using unauthorized channels to come instead of legal channels because there are no legal pathways to come, and that really has to change.
And I just want to add, if I could, one other thing on another note was, it's not just that we need immigrants to come and do low-wage jobs, but also immigrants, and if we're thinking about recovery from the pandemic and economic needs in the country, immigrants will open up businesses. A lot of them have been hurt during the pandemic because their businesses have been forced to close. But they are, a dynamic group that is willing to put energy into founding new businesses, into working at all kinds of jobs. I mean, they're an enormous benefit for this country. And so as we recover from the pandemic, as America, heads into the new decades ahead, without the baby boomers, right? With this need for new workers at all levels of society. It's not just at the low levels, it's higher levels too. I mean, look at the role that immigrants have played in the high-tech industry. I mean, that's not been low-level workers. That's been workers at the higher levels, and the country has really benefited from that. And I think it's so that I think we have to look at all those spheres, not just at low-wage workers.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you both for this excellent, informative discussion, and thank you to all our many attendees joining us on Zoom. And with that, I'll just give it to you for any final thoughts, Nancy or Muzaffar.
Oh, I hope you'll all read my book, I can say. No, I hope that this has been informative, obviously, but also that it brings out really the important role that immigrants are playing in the United States. And it's not just that they helped in the past transform America. There's a lot of nostalgia and romanticization actually about the role of immigrants in the past, that they made America great, that this is an immigrant country. And yes, that's true. But we need to focus too on how immigrants who are coming today, who've come in the last decades and who are coming now, how they also have been contributing to America, how they have been very vital to all sorts of domains in American society, and that we should be aware of their contributions and how they are part of the constant evolution of American society. Just as they were in the past, America is always changing and developing, and immigrants are a really important part of the story. And to come back to the numbers, you know, we're talking about 26% of the country are immigrants or children of immigrants. And if we talk about their grandchildren, they're even more. So they're a very, very significant part of America. And we need to, you know, be grateful to them for coming, but also, you know, understand the way they're changing and contributing to the country.
Great. So next time we have Nancy's second edition of this, it'll be 1/3 of the nation.
I know.
That will have to change. So just as a consumer of Nancy's knowledge over the years, I want to thank you on behalf of people who benefited from this. And I really think that those of you who read it will think about your country in a very different way, in the way immigrants and immigration is shaping us almost on a daily basis. So thank you for writing the book, and thank you for writing it so effortlessly for a reader. And not for you, I'm sure. And thanks for having done it during COVID, which is a big accomplishment.
And thank you for your, thank you.
Really, and thank you, Mac, and thank you, Roosevelt Institute, for hosting this event.
All right, with that, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, good night.